All right, we're live.
All right, boys and girls, we are back with another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, Ben Domenech. You can email the show, as always, at radio@thefederalist.com. I'm happy to be joined today by not one, not two, but three guests to talk about something that I think probably everybody in America is talking about right about now. Emily Jashinsky is culture editor at The Federalist. Hi, Emily.
Hi, Ben.
Ellie Bufkin is a writer and producer at Sinclair. She's also a senior contributor at The Federalist. Hi, Ellie.
Hello.
And Rachel Bovard is policy director at the Conservative Partnership Institute. Hi, Rachel.
Hi there.
I feel a little bit out of sorts that I have not one but two sommeliers in this conversation, and yet we're not going to be talking about something fun like that.
Ben does mean, of course, me. Franzia to everyone listening. Make a lovely Chardonnay.
She handles all the best pairings of White Claw. In all of its different
Coors Light, it goes great with McDonald's.
Oh. Just hurts my heart, but okay.
Well, yeah, it does. That's what it does. I wanted to talk to you all about this conversation that is playing out concerning the idea of vaccine passports. And I think a lot of people were initially of the mind that this was going to be something that they had to run into when they went overseas, when they traveled to other countries. And considering that that's something that, is controlled by other countries and that they might have to respect those types of rules, I think that was something that people were kind of willing to consider. And if you have to do international travel, it's the type of thing where, you understand that there are different rules involved, just as you would have to go through customs or something like that. Instead, now the concern is totally related to domestic policy. And it's one that is, I think, raising a number of issues that will probably cut across political lines, will raise a lot of hackles, particularly among more liberty-minded people on the right. And I know that all three of you have opinions about this, and I wanted to run through them all. Rachel, if I could start with you, because it seems to me that this is one of those issues where the awareness of Washington and the kind of upper class people who inhabit our leadership class is really out of touch with the way that Americans will actually respond to something like this. What were your thoughts when you started to hear about this story?
Well, I think initially, it struck me as immediately at odds with the idea of opening the country back up. If you are going to now place an extra burden for people to participate in the economy, to participate in society, that is fundamentally at odds with getting people back to work, getting people back to live music, restaurants, all these things. But I think, the second issue is that one of the things about COVID and the government's response to it more broadly is that this has been a very classist pandemic. And what I mean by that is so much of our COVID policies have been built around sort of this white collar, upper middle class people that can sit at home and survive the pandemic with their Uber Eats and their Amazon Prime and, not really worry about it. The vaccine passport, I think, is another element of that, because when you think about the people who are going to get the vaccine, they're that same class of people. And they're the class of people, that will be prioritized because, their employer, gets it for them, or, they somehow make a case that they're an essential worker or all these things. But the actual essential workers aren't really necessarily being prioritized. But more than that, they're not even accessing the vaccine, because when you look at vaccine hesitancy, it's a lot in the African-American community. It exists among, illegal aliens, or people that are homeless, even if they're not vaccine hesitant, they're not necessarily lining up to access the vaccine because they're not accessing the ports by which it is delivered. So you're effectively cutting off a segment of the society from participating, and again, sort of entrenching this very classist way we've handled this pandemic. So that's not even getting into the rampant privacy concerns I have with this, which again, we're like revisiting the contact tracing debate that we had around this time last year. But those two elements of it struck me initially.
Ellie, tell me a little bit about your reaction to this. I know that this is one of those issues where, it has less to do with, I think, some kind of deeply held, ideologically sophisticated rejection of the relationship between the citizen and the state, and more just that people feel like they're not used to this type of thing being demanded by the American government.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. And I think that that's the reaction that seems extremely logical to me that people would have. And I also just felt like my reaction yesterday to the White House trying to put this off and say, oh, well, it's not going to be something that we federally mandate. We're going to lean on the private sector to do this. And I think that really immediately raised an alarm for me about, well, we're actually putting so much trust in private corporations right now that we're already having an argument about the power that these private companies have. And exactly what Rachel was just saying about, we want to talk about equity. We have an equity director in the White House COVID response team. Well, the least equitable thing you could ever do would be to just disseminate people based on who's had a vaccine and who has not had a vaccine. Because as she mentioned, you might not want to say it out loud from the White House press room, but it is communities of color, immigrant communities that are most resistant to getting this vaccine. So the second that you put a piece of paper in someone's hand and say, hey, you can't be a normal American, you can't have a normal life unless you wave this badge around and prove that you bowed the knee to whatever science we sort of half-baked and gave to you and told you that this is what you need to do, it's just going to be an absolute disaster. It doesn't matter if it's limited to just, Walmart and Cracker Barrel or whatever it is. It doesn't, as soon as any companies adopt this and decide we're going to lean on the CDC recommendation, the federal recommendations that we've all been listening to for the last year, despite the fact that most of them are not based on actual data or what's actually happening in this country. And we're going to make all of our decisions and rule your life based on them. Because as much as we love this, sort of libertarian ideology, like, oh, well, if corporations want to do what they do, then we'll, just start your own or just go do a different one. Like, that's their business. Well, it's just not true these days. When we have tech giants, when we have, corporate big box giants, they rule our lives, especially in the pandemic. We already have limited choices. And when we take more of them away, it's going to ghettoize people, and just in a really unpleasant and extremely dangerous way. And, not to mention the rampant privacy concerns that Rachel raised as well. I mean, I'm not even getting into that.
Well, I do want to talk about the privacy issue, but before we do, Emily, I'm curious about your attitude toward this, because there's a whole host of Americans, potentially millions and millions of Americans who have already gotten COVID and recovered from it. I know that there are several, honestly, I think most of my friends at this point have gotten COVID and recovered from it. And so the idea that they would then go through the rigmarole in order to get the vaccine, most of those people are saying, look, I already had it. I don't think that I can get it again. Until they tell me I can get it again, I'm not going to go through all of that. What about those people and people in that situation?
Well, first of all, Ben, most of your friends have had COVID because most of your friends are also friends of Chris Bedford's.
Yes.
Spread it so generously.
He's just a very giving, generous soul.
Just in time for the holidays. Anyway, so Ellie just finished on an interesting point, which is that she said, I haven't even gotten into the privacy issues, but I actually think a lot of Ellie's points pertain to the privacy issue, because it's this entire conversation about how all of the people who have mismanaged the science and technology now want us to hand over the personal information and to trust. For instance, if you have had coronavirus, if you have encountered Chris Bedford in the last 6 months, then you still have to go through this process, whether it's New York State mandating it, whether it's a giant corporation that essentially has the power of the state. I'm not talking about, a local business or anything like that. I'm talking about like some of these massive corporations that essentially function as monopolies and are basically as powerful as a lot of governments around the world. That's a very different thing when we're putting all of this personal information into their hands. First of all, because I don't trust them to manage it securely and to manage it competently. But second of all, because it's a huge step towards numbing us to federal mandates about health and federal mandates about our personal lives. And I'll just finish on this. I was on Rising this morning and I mentioned that point, and someone said, listen, we've been being surveilled by corporations and by the government for a long time, and we've shown that we're sort of like the boiled frog. We've shown tolerance for it over and over and again. But I just think this constitutes another kind of escalation. beyond, what we've seen with, Snowden or FISA or whatever it is. This is another level of escalation because it's so dramatic. The level of interference in personal life with any kind of mandate like this. So that's sort of where my thinking is right now.
Imagine if tomorrow Jeff Bezos announces that for the good of the country, he's not going to allow anyone to be a member of Amazon Prime unless they've been vaccinated.
Yeah.
Now, I know that sounds ridiculous but it's actually not that ridiculous. And it's not that different from Walmart or Target announcing that if you come and work for us, you have to do this. It's really not that different. And while I know that my secular big tech libertarian friends will all say that that's all, well and good and fine, and you can just, go and build your own Amazon, my response to this is we have now reached a point where corporations, large, enormous corporations, in some cases, potentially monopoly corporations, are exercising outsized power in our lives. And while they don't have it backed with the force of a gun, while they don't have the equivalent of an army or a police force, they can be just as disruptive as the police force that shuts you down. They can close off your business. They can close off your ability to participate in the marketplace. They can have an enormous impact on your livelihoods and on your family. And from my perspective, just the idea that the White House is basically going to do something that is, if they had done it themselves, on its face unconstitutional in the same way that say a federal mask mandate would probably not withstand a constitutional test. They're basically just saying we're going to do an end run around that. We found this loophole where we can just lean on all of these corporate entities to do the things that we can't do because they actually exercise more power, and as institutions they can actually function in ways that we can't because the FBI is not about to go around arresting people for not abiding by mask mandates and the like. Though if they did, they would definitely prioritize that over finding anybody who was a potential shooter. The thing that seems to me to circle back to this privacy issue is that is really disturbing is that in the last year, we really have seen, I think, a degradation of what has historically been something that was centrally important in American life, which was privacy when it comes to particularly your health and the way that you live. And that's something that used to be a bipartisan held, sort of the thing. It's something that everybody valued. Now I feel like it's becoming, at least depicted in the media, as being some type of fringe activity. And they're constantly warning about the private sharing of information. For instance, I'm thinking, I know this is an odd connection, but of the complaints recently that emerged about Clubhouse, that they weren't keeping records of things that people were saying so that the media could fact check and attempt to cancel people who said inappropriate or incorrect things. The whole idea of having any kind of privacy seems to be going out the window. I don't know if anybody has a strong opinion about that, but Ellie or Rachel, what do you think about that?
So I think you've hit on two really key elements of this COVID pandemic. And the first is that sort of this outsourcing of government power to supra-governmental bodies that are technically private, but again, have amassed so much power over our lives that they can effectively operate as a government without any kind of accountability, and in fact, with complete and total autonomy. And, we started to see this almost a year ago, I think around this time, and it was with Facebook, when Facebook started to enforce against anyone organizing an anti-lockdown protest on their platform. So anyone who wanted to, organize for the protest or talk about the protest, they were banned. And the reason that Facebook gave was, well, we'll ban anything that we think is violating local laws. Or not even laws, guidances around social distancing. And so you saw, again, what would be constitutionally protected speech in any other venue. And were the government to do this, the government could not do this. If people wanted to organize to protest something their government was doing, again, not even laws, but guidances, they would have to be allowed. But because Facebook, as a private actor, stepped in, effectively shut that down. Now you saw it. Again, we saw this all over big tech, but to me, that was really the first crossing of that Rubicon, was when Facebook started to do this about this time a year ago. But I think the second really big thing we've seen is that you touched on is this, placement of private health data into the public sphere as a method of shaming and a method of compliance, and a method of forcing everyone to abide by sort of the same requirements in how they live. This used to be a sacrosanct principle of American federal law. Technically, it still is. HIPAA still exists, but the government has relaxed HIPAA to such a degree with regard to coronavirus that it almost doesn't exist. And again, this was back when, again, a year ago, when we started with this contact tracing conversation, when you saw Google and Apple get into the game and say, we are going to produce apps that contact trace you. And everyone was like, oh, this is so good. Seal clapping. This is great. But there was a huge question mark about what are these companies going to do with this very personal private health data. There's no restrictions. We have no federal law that accounts for this. And what I thought was really interesting was, as much as the government praised these companies, as much as, sort of their backers here in Washington, among the think tanks praised these companies, no one used these apps because everybody's terrified of them. And so, I do think that we are in a very concerning phase now where our health data, our vaccine status, which again should be privately held information, is now part of this increasing social credit score that we have as it relates to how we, interface with society. And this all happened so fast. I can't get over that. I mean, it's been 1 year. We've wiped out huge norms as it relates to how we interact with each other and our data.
Ellie, what are your thoughts on this?
I want to echo what she said. And the other thing is, I was in New York City over the weekend, and going back to kind of, the failure of the contact tracing effort was really apparent. I went to a couple different restaurants, and the hostesses were, obliged, I guess legally, I'm not really sure what the mandatory requirements are there, but she had to ask me every time, what's my phone number? What's my home address? Where am I staying? And under what obligation am I, as someone who protects my freedom, and I, am cagey about giving out that kind of information. And what other obligation am I to give her the correct information? Like, none. She's not going to call and check on it. So I didn't. And I imagine that most other people don't participate actively in this either. Like, who wants to just hand out their information? It's like letting someone use your debit card that you've never met before. I think it's kind of the same thing with the vaccination. First of all, how do you verify these passports? Are people going to really scrutinize them? Is it going to be like a driver's license thing with a barcode? If that's the case, are we really going to ask our older citizens to do this? These are the people that I think, are going to be the least able. I mean, not just the most resistant, but also probably the least able to get, a phone with an app that they have to pull out every time they walk into a store. I thought about that movie Contagion because obviously it has so many parallels in our actual life, fortunately. But at the end of the movie, when they started getting vaccines, they got like colored armbands that they could wave at like some magic thing. It's like, well, I guess maybe something like that. But then again, it's like, how easy would that sort of thing be to forge? I look at these handwritten vaccination cards that my parents have gotten, and they have, the dates handwritten with ballpoint pen on when they got their doses. And it's like, okay, well, I guess if you laminate it, that makes it like official. But I could make that in 10 minutes right now and just be fine if that's something that's required. So, the questions just keep piling up. How are you going to actually do this and enforce it? I mean, how long did it take to get U.S. passports to the point where they are now, almost impossible to forge? It took decades to do that, right? It took decades to get driver's licenses to the real ID status that, we're required to get now. So we're talking about, businesses can ask about this, but then they're going to have to train and employ essentially bouncers to be able to spot a fake vaccination passport, whatever that's going to look like. I would hope by the time this actually becomes something that's like a feasible, implementable thing, that the pandemic is so history that we don't even have to think about it anymore. So logistically, I like that there's so many hurdles. But I think going back to like my major concern with this issue is exactly what Rachel was saying. It's kind of like using big tech and using big corporations that are outspokenly biased toward the White House. They agree with Biden and his administration, and they will be used as foot soldiers, essentially, to enact policy priorities that are not going to be possible because of, one, the U.S. Constitution, and two, other statutes, like you mentioned, HIPAA, and also the fact that you would need legislative cooperation, at least somewhat, from both parties in order to get some kind of like real federal law passed, which obviously is not going to happen. And then, of course, you have state participation, which you're not going to get. So you'll get a minimum amount of states that'll say, okay, we'll implement something like this for ourselves. Obviously, New York is more than willing, shocker, but you're never going to get something like that from DeSantis, who has, gone out of his way already to say that he's going to sign executive action to prevent it happening at all. And I certainly hope his move, which I think is very helpful in protecting his citizens, at least within the state of Florida, would be echoed by other state leaders, because I think it's an important policy position to copy at this point.
Emily Jashinsky, I'm sure that you're someone who had a thriving fake ID business when you were in high school.
I actually never had a fake ID.
Yeah, sure. I just wonder whether you think that this is going to be something that turns very quickly into a situation where there's all manner of people who are faking this, in the same way that we've seen people fake all types of other pieces of information from the government in order, particularly if you're an immigrant here illegally, to access the workforce and to essentially try to find a way to participate to the extent you can in society.
I mean, of course. And that's why we have federalism in this country. And that's why I have concerns about privacy, because you're handing over these decisions and this information to what we know are the layers upon layers of incompetent and inefficient bureaucracy that exist at the state level across the country. And then if this escalated at some point to the federal level, my goodness. I mean, it's one, people have been saying, listen, we do this to get into public schools, X, Y, and Z. First of all, a lot of people disagree with that. And second of all, that is the beauty of federalism, is that often on the local level, when they are, asking you to do things like that, it's really easy for you to go to the street down the road. It might not be the easiest thing in the world, but it's possible. Or it's possible for you to find a private option, or it's possible for you to find an exemption. This is not something that's really easy to do when you have to go through layers of bureaucracy. And on top of that, what all of this glosses over is the fact that when you do poll and when you do just gauge the temperature in this country right now, period, there's such profound distrust in institutions that creating massive passports, whether they're corporate, or not, it's going to just make that distrust. It's like throwing gasoline on the fire. Now people are being asked to give Amazon or Apple, with those apps, as we talked about earlier, if a version of those apps becomes popularized because of mandates, corporate or otherwise, if that becomes popularized and you're just sort of inserting digital data and giving it to a major corporation like Apple, people are going to lose their freaking minds. And people have very good reasons to distrust all of our institutions in this country. That doesn't mean that it's not channeled into some irrational and silly theories and everything. Of course it is, but they have good reason to distrust the institutions. And that's what nobody here in Washington has any stomach to deal with.
So let me play devil's advocate for a minute, because I think we're all on the same side of this. The response from a techno-futurist, secular libertarian type. I'll imagine Tyler Cowen, but I'm not as smart as Tyler. Would be something like, "You're all being paranoid. You're being ridiculous. These are big companies that have provided much better services and are more trusted institutions than the government itself. If anything, we can trust them more to be responsive to consumers when it comes to their data than we can the federal government, which is routinely hacked and loses things all the time and mismanages things in all manner of ways. That, yes, the CDC has made a ton of mistakes along the way, and the FDA has made a ton of mistakes along the way. Well, guess what? Amazon will be more incentivized to avoid those mistakes going forward. So will Apple. They have made enormously popular products. And if they make it a condition of using their products that that you are required or have some other kind of basis for getting the vaccine, that's going to be a strong nudge in a direction. But people who have health reasons to not do so, there'll be an adjudication process, and they'll go through that, and they're going to try to meet those customers where they are, and it's going to be good for public health. At the end of the day, we should have more faith in these pharmaceutical companies and major tech institutions than we do the government. What do you all say to that argument?
So I'll start, because I hear this a lot. When I started waving the flag about big tech, probably a year and a half ago now, I got this a lot. Well, you're being paranoid. These companies have no incentive to upset half their user base. They will never do what you're suggesting. Stop hating on business. And I think the last year, it kind of goes back to something I was saying about how fast all this has happened. The last year, I think, has borne out a lot of the concerns that people like me had about corporations that were almost as powerful, if not more powerful than the government. And I think people who have an open mind about where threats to liberty can come have seen that, it can come from a corporate sector just as much as it can come from the government. So I think that's issue number one. But issue number two, when it comes to whether these corporations are to be trusted with our data, the libertarians are right that the government isn't to be trusted either, right? I'm a former federal employee. My data has been hacked at OPM numerous times, right? I have every possible, credit tracking app because my data is everywhere. But it's not just from OPM; it's every other private entity that's been hacked as well. I don't think anyone has cornered the market on cybersecurity enough for me to feel completely comfortable with that. But I think the final point on this is that there is no accountability or trust mechanism with any of these companies. There is no federal privacy regime as to what these companies are allowed to do with our data. And there is no transparency as to what they do with it. So we are merely told to trust them. And we are told to trust the entities that do not have a base of trust in this country anymore. Big tech, their polls abound showing how companies do not trust big tech, and yet we are supposed to willingly give them our data. One quick example of this is that, Google's acquisition of Fitbit, I don't know how many months ago now, or a year ago, they bought the health data of 28 million users. They've never said what they're going to do with it. They've never told anyone what they're going to do with it. Add to that the fact that Ascension Health, one of the biggest hospital chains in the United States, willingly partnered with Google to share the full medical records, dates of birth, names, privacy, labs, every medical test you've ever had with Google, and didn't have to tell their patients, didn't have to tell their doctor. So I think that there is very, very firm ground to be suspicious of what these companies will do, because at the end of the day, they're not for the public good. They're for making money. And the profit motive, I think, Ben, you said it really well recently. We always trusted the profit motive to incentivize good behavior. But we've seen these companies now have so much power that it's not merely that Republicans buy sneakers too. It's, well, should they? And what kind of role these corporations now see themselves in fostering a society that they want. Mm-hmm. And, what are they willing to do down that road gives me great concern about the requirements they would force, on the rest of us to that end.
Ellie, there's this whole element of this too that I think is based on the fact that Americans have been so willing to sacrifice their privacy in inviting these products into their home. In other words, if I was, Bezos or something like that, and you're pushing back against me for, making this kind of push toward vaccination, well, I mean, you've already invited us to listen to you all day long, to know everything about you. We know when you're pregnant before you're pregnant, that kind of thing. Is this a situation where we might just be coming to a wake-up call about how much corporations actually know about us in a way that maybe people had not recognized before?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we're going to start finding, when it starts coming to disseminating who's had a vaccine and who's not right away willing to get a vaccine, you're going to start finding, old tweets or old Facebook comments or just anything with a question mark. Did this person not immediately jump on board to team vaccination? And I mean, in fairness, I'm very pro COVID vaccine, but they are 3 vaccines that were just introduced and they're still all under EAU. They're not actually approved vaccinations. And there's a lot of reason to have questions about that. And I actually worry about it less for adults than I do when some sort of mandate comes out or some passport is necessary for school children, coming down into the future when they are approved for emergency use authorization for children under 16, which is definitely, coming in the next 6 months or a year. Are people going to, put the stamp on their kids' arms so that they can go back to school? Is that what it's going to take? And I think that kind of thing is really scary. And I think that there's going to be a lot of exactly like what you said, going back and pointing out, trying to sift through who are the questioners and who are the people that have been in lockstep, from the beginning. But the other thing is, and I am having a hard time seeing why there's not more foresight, or maybe just an ignorance of foresight. The fact that this is going to be very racist. As soon as you get vaccine requirements and you have to start separating people you approve of versus people you don't approve of based on whether or not they've had the vaccine, the very first category of people that you're going to be attacking are going to be African-American people. And this is at a moment in this country where, one of the big fights is obviously against critical race theory, where people are literally looking for race and racism in every single aspect of their life. And here's one which is marching in with an enormous flag saying, this is insanely racist. And everyone's just kind of ushering it in and adopting it as though that's not going to be a problem, because obviously in their minds, the only people who are going to resist vaccines are Trumpites who, are ridiculous and have conspiracy theories and don't believe in this type of thing. And they're going to find out very quickly that that's true. I'm kind of hoping that maybe that reason, and maybe coupled with other reasons, are going to be sort of the end of this idea of a vaccine passport. Something else I want to bring up, just to kind of pivot a little bit here, is yesterday, and this was really underreported for some reason, the CDC director, Rochelle Walensky, was on Maddow last night on MSNBC and said that she doesn't actually believe that you can transmit the virus once you've had the vaccine, which I think we all know. And I think that, smart doctors have been saying for a while, but to actually hear that language from the CDC is new in my personal reporting experience. And it's, again, something somebody asked her about it today when she was with Governor Baker in Massachusetts. And she didn't backtrack, but she didn't really say exactly what she said yesterday. But she's now on record as saying that once you've been vaccinated, you really can't transmit the virus anymore, which I think is just two steps away from dangling the carrot that people have been looking for. I don't want to wear my mask anymore. So now that I can't transmit, I really shouldn't have to. I can just go back to normal. So I think it's interesting that it seems like there's a monster in a cage, maybe, of, okay, here's the truth of it, and here's what we're not allowed to say in an official capacity, which I think is something else that, if we're going to start talking about vaccine passports, we should be really alarmed about the fact that the language from the CDC is very clearly being edited or tailor-made, to fit whatever is going on from, the White House or from wherever. So yeah, and I answered that question and then several others.
Emily, you brought up federalism before, and I think that this is going to be a huge test for federalism, because it's such a tangible, either you're going to do this thing or you're not. And there are two things that I think, well, first off, it's going to resemble a little bit, we got a preview of it with the Texas reopening, where Joe Biden comes out and says this is Neanderthal thinking. And then he reiterates, the other day, you need to bring back your mask mandates, et cetera, et cetera. Well, guess what? These states aren't doing that, and they're not going to do that because their voters don't want them to do that. And that's something that I think, is just, it's not something that the White House can control. It's certainly not something that Dr. Fauci can control, much to his chagrin. The thing, though, that I think is going to be interesting here is that the way that the left likes to subvert federalism, if they can't do it with the law, is they do it with money. And to me, the likeliest way that they're going to approach this issue is they're going to say, here is a huge bucket of money for you and for your Medicaid program if you just make vaccination something that's mandatory or effectively mandatory. And that's something that, during the fight over Obamacare proved very difficult for Republican governors and Republican administrations to resist, even though they knew they would eventually be on the hook for a bunch of the money for the people they added to that program. What do you think is going to play out in terms of the way that this argument goes going forward? And do you think we're going to see, efforts along those lines in order to try to compel states to do something that their own voters may not want them to do?
That is how these tyrants here in DC got the great state of Wisconsin to change our drinking age to 21. It's very sad.
Fascists.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, so no, I mean, I think you raise a really good point, one that I hadn't even thought about, even just looking back to an example as recent as Obamacare, the way that, isn't that just such a sad statement on the federal behemoth that they have these resources to bribe 50 states to do things
with their own money.
I like seeing this as the entire pandemic has been a major test for federalism. And I think, you do see people like Ron DeSantis or like Kristi Noem on the lockdown issue really leaning into showcasing the power and the essential, the imperative nature of federalism. But what's been so creepy to me is that, living here in DC, I think these like neoliberal technocrats that go to the fancy coffee places all the time, I actually think they would love a federal mask mandate. I think they would love a federal vaccine passport. So like, we're talking about this on the state level, but what's honestly kind of more disturbing to me is that I really fully believe that the appetite or the urgency exists here where the ruling class makes their homes to actually like federalize all of this. It's about efficiency. It's about Pete Buttigieg thinking he has the brilliant, he will fix this by taxing us per mile we drive and putting a little chip in our car and it'll be wonderful. And, it's like we've been hearing the cultural slippery slope argument for years and years and years. And some of us have been the canaries in the coal mine. And all of a sudden last summer exploded and the left freaks out and signs the Harper's letter. And, I'm sick and tired of acting like, no, it's not that bad. I'm just sick of it because clearly these things snowball. They snowball quickly. We live in a world that's changing because of technology so rapidly that the kind of boomer mindset that you can just kick back and like the system will work. No. Like we have to be defending it vigorously because public opinion is shifting really quickly. The corporations are centralizing their power. The government is centralizing their power. So there's just really no room for us to take our feet off the gas and be like, this time we'll just sort of like push federalism to the side, or we'll let the state do like the state governments take this, like make this huge power grab because it's an emergency. No, we can't keep doing that.
I can't wait for the TV doctor show subplots where there's a group of it'll probably be radical Orthodox Jews who have not been vaccinated or something like that. So the thing that I think is going to be a really interesting element of this argument going forward is it's going to be a good gauge of how much people have become aware of the fact that slippery slopes are so real and have been vindicated so often in so many areas. Because I can see a lot of people, naive people, making the argument that, oh, well, this is just a hurdle that we have to get over in order to reopen. And, this is dangerous, but it's not that different from, vaccine requirements in public schools or something along those lines. You'll have an adjudication process, et cetera. We just need to get through this. And it's not going to have any kind of long range ramifications for the way that the government views its authority over the way that you live. To which I think people who aren't naive will say, well, that's bullcrap. We know that that's bull because we know about the tendencies of all of these people. We know that, if it was up to Obama, he would be, he would have turned the knobs on people who weren't eating enough broccoli and the like. Of course, he also admitted that he was a smoker throughout his time at the White House, but apparently that's just, not something that he thinks people should be judged for. The thing that is to me really concerning about this is that I'm not sure. I think that the conservative base and an enormous number of people who are not even that political have a natural revulsion to what they view as a role on government's part that they've never held before. However, I'm worried that the politicians in Washington actually don't understand that, and that they don't know that that's a sizable portion of the American electorate and citizenry, and that instead they will be fooled into going along with something like this. Rachel, I know that you know a lot of politicians personally. Do you think that we can trust them to have some steel in their spine on something like this, or do you think that they'll effectively be gaslit by the media into being told that this is Alex Jones level conspiracy theorizing?
Well, it's funny. I just came from a meeting where I was not encouraged. I was with people who were saying, well, we really just need to remember the founding. And I'm like, guys, reading the Federalist Papers out loud as they, you know, shove you into the gulag isn't really gonna save you here. But, you know, I think that this is where I sort of claim my mantle as an elder millennial. And I say, guys, do you not remember 9/11? Do you not remember the days and the years that followed 9/11 and what we gave up in the name of security, in the name of the common good, in the name of protecting us from terrorism, were things that we never got back? And, you know, I do think that there's a class of legislators that does remember that, but that it's a small number. And, you know, we should have had these conversations then. And some people, you know, a minority did. But I hope that there are people around, you know, in my age group who were adults when that happened, you know, young adults watching all of this unfold, who still remember what it was like to go to airports before TSA, you know, remember how much life changed in the name of security, you know, and we've seen, I think, just how insidious that power became. You know, Edward Snowden, feel about him as you may, unmasked just how deeply the state invested itself in monitoring and tracking each individual citizen. And we've never been able to change that. The most we've ever done to the Patriot Act was effectively stop bulk metadata collection on citizens. And even then it was like, stop bulk metadata. Like we didn't know we don't know that the NSA is complying.
Yeah.
So the other thing I wanted to mention too is that I think it's really incumbent upon all of us to remember how abnormal some of this really is. And it goes back to something that Ellie said, you know, when she was talking about how these vaccines are still emergency use. Because I do see people all the time who gaslight people who are concerned about the vaccine. And they're like, well, you do it for your kids, right? Your kids get these vaccines before they go to school. All of those are FDA approved and have been for years. I mean, you are asking people to do something that's fundamentally abnormal, which is to take an emergency use vaccine, which is, you know, doesn't go through all the regular processing. And I'm not trying to spread doubt, right? But I'm saying these are facts that are real. And you're asking people to do that. And then the second thing is, you know, even at the top of this episode, Ben, you said, well, you know, we were used to this idea or effectively okay with the idea that maybe we had to do this to travel. But I will say this, there is only one vaccine that is required for US travelers to get when they travel. And it's only to 17 countries. It's a vaccine for yellow fever. And you only need it to go to 17 countries in Africa. Those are the only countries that require any kind of vaccination for US travelers. So I just want people to remember that we are living in an extremely abnormal time still. And what's being asked of us is outside of how we normally behave. Because I think if people keep that in mind and we're able to keep a high barometer for what's actually absurd and what is normal, then maybe we have a hope of returning to some sort of normalcy, or at least having the informed debates before we just trade away everything it means to be a free individual living in society.
Ellie, what do you think about that?
I think that, you know, one of the things that I think that your point about 9/11 and our loss of privacy in the age afterward is huge. And I think you're right, like being our age, we do remember a different time, and it never came back, despite the fact that the threat level changed entirely. So, you know, there's always going to be a reason to have to track people. Essentially, anything can come up, and there's definitely going to be more disease threat in the future, and it's never going to be the same. Flu season will never be the same. I've already kind of accepted that. You know, fundamentally, lawmakers are going to take charge in areas where they never did before. You know, I think one of the things that legislators right now in Congress can do that I think is really important is hang their hats on this fact that the Democrats in Congress are pushing hard for HR 1 or SB 1 as the most important thing that's ever happened. Nancy Pelosi said it was as important as the Constitution the other day. And what this will do is fundamentally change voter ID laws in the country. And if they're asking for no voters to have to prove who they are in order to cast a vote and select the leaders of our nation, that's so important to them, then they absolutely cannot also check the box that says they need to see proof that you've been vaccinated with an emergency use vaccination that's only been in existence for less than a year, that we just don't know exactly what's going to happen with it. And again, I'm not trying to, inject any doubt into taking the vaccine. When it's my turn, I'll take it. My parents both did. I'm glad they did. But it's everybody's right at this point to have that question. And the other thing I want to gripe about a little is this immediate association that people who are posting, and I got this from like conservative followers I have on Twitter, but as soon as I posted anything about, hey, this vaccine passport's a real bad idea, people were immediately responding like, well, I didn't know that you were anti-vax. It's like, where did that come from? I mean, I think that the idea that this association with being anti-vaccine just because you're anti-mass privacy infringement is absurd too. And I think that language has to change. So what I want my elected leaders in Capitol Hill to do right now is to focus on telling the Democrats, hey, well, we're not going to support anything about HR. Well, they shouldn't anyway. But we're not going to support anything about HR 1 until you say, absolutely, we're not going to support anything about a vaccine passport or vaccine requirements. And I'd love to see local legislators and local leaders like DeSantis signing on to executive action that says we will not be allowing any kind of this in the future. I think that's really powerful stuff, especially coming from state houses, especially coming from the governor's offices. That's maybe the most effective thing that we can do right now. But from Congress, I'd love to see them continuing to tell the other party, the Democrats on Capitol Hill, like this just isn't compatible with your logic of thinking IDs are hard to get. Okay, well, we're saying vaccine passports hard to get, and the two mute each other out. I mean, at best.
Emily, let's wrap it up with you. What are your thoughts on what's going to come next? And how happy are you that Heavy D won the governorship in Florida instead of Andrew Gillum?
Oh my goodness. I'm happy for the people of Florida. I'm happy for the spring breakers that have a chance to break free from cop cars. Just completely screwed up on White Claw, like good Americans. But anyway, no, I can tie everything together because I think this is about we are not living in normal times. And so for as much hay as people, including myself, made of some of the norms that Trump broke, and I don't think permanently, a lot of these norms, as we talk about the sort of metaphor of the boiling frog, were broken before Trump came. And it's the fault of our political class. It's the fault of our corporate class. It's also the fault of the fact that technology is advancing so rapidly, and we're just sort of like reeling from the world spinning around us, that we've made a lot of really bad decisions, and we've broken a lot of norms that our founding fathers would be really upset about. And so it's one of those things that's like, we're kind of already there. The question is, can we go back? And when we live in a world where the ruling class wields, I should say, these definitions of loaded terms like racism and bigotry and white supremacy and health and science, just like sort of concepts that we used to kind of all agree on the basic definition of. And when you marry that with the fact that everything is hyper politicized, it's really, really dangerous to start taking steps like this, to start, asking the government to mandate personal health decisions, because when the people in power operate on these really tough, these really false definitions of what constitutes negative behavior, then we're in for a very, very, very dangerous situation. And aside from the sort of privacy that could be invaded, you also have to ask just what this does to the division in our culture, which is already hampering us. Bill Maher made that point on his show a few weeks ago. You know who doesn't care about stereotypes of Chinese people in children's books? The Chinese. And they're eating our lunch while we're mired in these like stupid squabbles that the left insists on starting about things like Dr. Seuss. So, I mean, it's a very dangerous situation. And part of it is, almost all of it comes down to the fact that we are not living in normal times, and we sort of have to get used to and normalize the abnormality and then respond accordingly. And we're just not there yet.
Emily Jashinsky, Ellie Buffkin, Rachel Bovard, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and talk with me today.
Thanks, bud.
Thank you.
I'm Ben Domenech. You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.